Yeah, okay. So it's funny that he's sitting there, actually, because that's where me and Andy Martins and Matt Zach and Missy Nishaw and other people used to make fun of him while he preached. So it's good that he's there and I'm down here now. Anyway, so many of my formative years, many firsts took place here, for better or for worse. And here I am. It's really, really weird. I don't usually get nervous before I speak, but this is weird.
I took him on a tour of the building on whatever day it was, Thursday or Wednesday or something like that, and it was a walk down memory lane. Every room he went into was, oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, it's great to have you here because it's great to have someone who can talk about your journey and where you've been in Ancaster and what God's been doing there, but also with the unique ability to understand the context in which we minister and live and serve here in Morden. So it's really neat to kind of have you understand our culture and the uniqueness of this town, but at the same time have had a different experience in Ancaster there. And Ancaster is a church that's about 8 years old now, so wherever it moves from not being a church plant to being a church, it's kind of in that nebulous transition time there. But you were the church planter that happens there. We all know how easy church...
Surprise!
Yeah. We all know how easy church planting is, and how as a pastor, you're really impervious to any kind of disappointment or frustration that happen along the way. But could you give us a little snapshot of the congregation that you minister and serve in Ancaster?
Sure, yeah. Should I roll through some of these pictures?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so the first one are all the people that put up with me on a daily basis. So that's my wife, Shailene, the redhead. The live version of all these people is somewhere up there. Hey, kids. And my oldest son, Jackson, who's 11, my daughter, who is 8, Raya, and my youngest, Britt, who is 5. And so that's the Ancaster version of the Gerrards. So if we go to the next slide. So Ancaster is... oh, that's right there. Look at that. So technologically advanced here in Morden. So my wife and I were living and working in the West Coast, and Shay's a kindergarten teacher, and I was pastoring at a fairly traditional Alliance church there, and ended up resigning to go back to school, do a master's degree, and so we moved to Hamilton, which is home of McMaster Divinity School, and while we lived there for a year, never thinking we would stay there, we found this little community of Ancaster. Ancaster is a town of 70,000 people. I know that's hard for the city of Morden to understand, but small little town of 70,000 people. And it was forced in the early 90s to amalgamate with Hamilton. So although we're technically part of Hamilton, we're very much Ancasterites. We have our own identity. And we discovered this place while I was there at school and fell in love with it, walked around with it. It's the 3rd oldest community in what was Upper Canada, so it's got a lot of history. It's a beautiful little place. And actually, in many ways, I often say this to Shay, reminds me of Morden. It has, especially in the village of Ancaster, it has a bump into people you know kind of feel. And so we fell in love with it, thinking we'd end up back on the West Coast. A whole bunch of crazy things happened, including living with my mom and dad in their basement for a wonderful 10 months that they really enjoyed. And through just a bunch of bizarre events, ended up back in Ancaster with this, what can only be described as a bizarre, God-ordained, Spirit-led, you're going to start something new here in this community. So we did. So that's Ancaster, in between Toronto and Niagara Falls, in the Golden Horseshoe area there. So we'll go to the next slide. I don't know what's going on. Oh yeah, so we started in the upper room at the Coach and Lantern Pub. This pub was built in 1798. Really cool, great place. And so about 20 of us that had this dream together began meeting there on Monday nights upstairs in the pub. And if you go to the next slide, that's what life looked like for us in there. And so there were 2 things that we knew were going to be central to what life for us as a church was going to be. The first one was figuring out how to contextualize the gospel for a particular location. So what does it mean to live the Jesus life very intentionally in the midst of this community? And the second part was, how do we do that together as a church family, fully embracing the crazy things that we believe as Jesus followers, that he shows up, he speaks, he heals, he does just crazy stuff. So how do we live that balance? So that was birth, that was our DNA that existed with the Kilkenny signs in the background, and we had our own bartender, and it was great. So if we go to the next slide, there's just another shot, and what's next? Let's see. There's the kids. When we started, there were only 4 kids. Now there's 107 or so, roughly. No, I guess sarcasm. There's about 40. Anyway, a lot of kids.
Those are pastor numbers.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, that's how we keep
40
track of
equals
things.
170.
170. So next slide. And then we found our own spot still in the village, and then moved from being the church with no name to Ancaster Village Church, which was just a reflection of our geography and where we were invested. Next slide. And so what began to happen was we said our DNA needs to reflect how we invest in a particular community to rub shoulders with people. And so we very much bought into this idea that we are not going to create things within our walls to which we will invite people. We are going to go to where things already exist and show up with love and money and people power and all that stuff. So this tree lighting that had been happening in Ancaster for 20-some years, we went to it, saw it, and thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity for us. Went to the organizers. They were more than happy to give it to us. And so we took it over about 5 years ago. And our church funds it and gets involved with it and that kind of thing. So that was big news in the Ancaster news. And so if you go to the next slide. So it went from this little thing that had several hundred people to now about 3,000 people that show up. And it's great. It's not a necessarily evangelistic kind of thing, but it's just an opportunity for us to serve, to demonstrate to the community that we're there to serve them. And we want to be the kind of church that if we closed our doors, packed up and left, that the community would say, we miss Ancaster Village Church. They brought value to our community. They contributed something to our community. So I think there's a couple slides here. Things I never learned in seminary was how to locate reindeer rentals. And so if anybody's in the market for reindeer, I can hook you up. Next slide. Yeah, and so other things, that's our building that we rent behind there, middle of the town, and there's this amazing farmers market that takes place. Again, just another opportunity for us to say, here's something that already exists. How do we get in? How do we add value to it? So if you go to the next slide, we created a partnership with the Community Services Organization, and if people bring canned goods or whatever to the market, we give them $5 that our church pays for to spend at the market, and then we take the supplies to community services, and everybody wins. And again, it's just an opportunity for us to rub shoulders, to demonstrate Christ's love, and to build relationships with people. So lots of things like that that we've tried to invest in and do as we try to be Jesus within our community. So next slide. Refugee sponsorship is something that kind of fell in our lap about 4 years ago now. This is us meeting our first family from Syria after the crisis kind of made headlines here in Canada. And we've got a couple families now, and we're waiting for the next 4 that just got approval to come. So our little church of 70 people has found just an incredible way to both minister and really to be ministered to as we've got involved with this. So next slide. Oh, there's, yep. Refugees coming in. So Ancaster also had this thing called Ancaster Heritage Days, which is the best small town festival ever that ever existed, better than any other small town festival that exists. No, truth be told, when I started volunteering on the committee that organized this, and then within a matter of time ended up chairing it, and would often try and describe to this committee just what the Corn and Apple Festival was like. And as you can see, we turned it from what was just a few kids inflatables and a soapbox derby to now something that gets about 8,000 people over the weekend. And I run that. If you go to the next slide, there's me looking very official. And our church backs it. And so I have the best job description in the world. My church has created a job description that is all about me serving the community. And so if I'm not out doing stuff, volunteering in these positions, then they fire me. So I love it. I can't imagine doing anything else. Okay, next slide. We've really tried to invest in settler First Nations relationships in the country. So this is something called a blanket exercise. If you've never done it, you should look into it. It's a great thing to learn about the history of first generation European Canadians and our story alongside First Nations people in the country. So that's been an opportunity for us to draw the community in. This is something that we've done in our church to, again, to rub shoulders and to try and teach our community about stuff. So perfect, next slide. And what do we got next? Oh yeah, so here's me just bragging that I was nominated for the Citizen of the Year nominee. Just hands up if you've been nominated for Citizen of the Year. No. So no, the only reason I asked my family last night, I was like, this is super arrogant to put this in here. But the reason I did it is because this is really just a reflection of our church. And there were 4 of us guys and one 74-year-old beautiful old lady. So none of us had a chance. She won, so I didn't win. But the nomination was really a reflection of our church's values, that after existing at this point for 6 years, the community saw our church and me and what we were doing there as an essential part of the community and living this unique story of service and hope and hospitality. So anyway, that's why I show that off. Plus I had hair then, so different world. And so yeah, we'll just breeze through these next slides and we'll end at the last one. Just some shots of us living our life together. All right, so the second part I said was, how do we embrace being the crazy people who believe that Jesus is real, shows up, speaks, and does stuff in our midst? Because it was one thing to build relationships with our community. It was a completely different thing to have them see that this is more than just people doing nice things, that there was something unique and bizarre about us. So this is a shot of our communion table that we participate in every week, and you can see it has this icon, this picture of Jesus. And for us, it really is, we're well aware that that's probably not what Jesus looked like. But that candle that's there that we light at the beginning of all our services to remind us that the Spirit is with us, that picture of Jesus that's there, the bread and the cup, you can see the little vase of oil that we use for anointing and praying healing over people. It started as just a nice idea that we would have these things, but it's really become the central piece of what we do as a church. And so our model of how we make decisions, our model of leadership, our model of what we're inviting people to see us be and do is centered around this real presence of Jesus in our life. One quick story and then I'll turn it back over to you. So my kids know about Andy Martins, who's up there in the middle, and they've heard many stories about him. And so, because that's when they want to go to sleep at night, I have to think of something, and so I tell them stories about me and Andy. And so Andy was my best friend here growing up. And so one of the stories involves chili and the aftermath of said chili. And so this is a story that they quite like. And so last night or 2 nights ago, I just mentioned at the table at Laurel's house that Andy was going to be there, probably going to be there on Sunday. Thanks for getting out of bed. And my daughter looks at me and says, "Is that the chili one?" And I said, "Yes, that's the chili one." The reason I tell you that story is as I watch different people in our church preach that are part of our speaking team and myself and others as we do healing and stuff, I've noticed over the years that people point to that picture of Jesus and they point to the bread and the cup when they're talking about him, because it's a little bit like telling a story and then getting to meet him for the first time. So Raya is going to meet Andy for the first time this morning, but Andy's a real person to her. She knows the stories about him, and now she's going to meet him. And so when we preach and we speak and we anoint people and we pray for people in our church, it's always like we're introducing them to this person who we believe really exists, that we have stories to share about him. It's like opening the family photo album and talking about crazy Uncle Joe or whatever, and saying that this isn't just some idea or myth or fable or thing that we used to believe in. This is a real person who lives and breathes and speaks to us and enters into our life. And so we just keep trying to figure out ways to make him be there. Well, not make him be there with us, but expose us to his presence that's there with us. So thanks for that, Andy. Appreciate that.
That's great. We can leave this. I'd like to leave this picture up throughout the rest of the service as we spend time together. But that's amazing how you have this little church that is making such a huge community impact. You were telling me about some of the ways how the community, you brought in to like mediate things in the community with business owners. Like God's given you tons of favor there, which is really awesome. And it's so good that it's been smooth sailing like that, like the entire time.
Yeah.
I know that's also sarcasm because it hasn't been, but can you give us a glimpse into some of maybe the early days of doing this? Because I think that has huge ramifications for how God is blessing you today because of what has happened in part of your journey going here. But that would it'd be a huge blessing to hear a snapshot from that.
So, without doubt, one of the unfortunate things about the reality of experiencing the presence of Jesus in your midst is it has this remarkable way of happening in great ways when life falls apart. And I don't know if that's just because that creates special ways for us to experience him, or maybe we're just more apt to searching for him in those moments. But when Shay and I moved to Ancaster, you have this idea of how you're going to plant a church. And it usually includes you as the pastor and the family ministering and serving others. It turned out to be just the opposite for us, because within a year of being there, it was within a week of, within 7 days, my wife got diagnosed with melanoma, so skin cancer. My oldest son started having epileptic seizures. We got some fun news from the CRA that they thought we owed them a boatload of money that I didn't have, which I wasn't doing anything illegal. I know that that's probably what you're thinking, but and we had some strange things happen with our leadership team at the church, and life really fell apart, like really, really fell apart. Both Shay and I went into a really dark season of depression, suicide. Like, it was a mess. It was just an absolute mess. And yet, something beautiful happened as we journeyed through that, which was me, the pastor, getting up. I distinctly remember in the upper room at that pub, getting up to preach, beginning my sermons by saying, I don't really believe any of this. I'm right on the fence here, and when this sermon's done, this might be the last time you ever see me, because I'm pretty convinced that this is all fake and we just die meaningless deaths. And my little group of 30 people are just smiling at me. Great. Well, this is going to be an excellent sermon. But it was, not because the sermon was so great, but because it created an opportunity for real vulnerability. And if I can get up and show how much of a big mess I am, and how broken I am, and how much I am in desperate need of Jesus to be real, because that was my question. It was, I've grown up my whole life listening to this, many sermons up there, different things that I experienced in this room that created a foundation for me. But my question was, is any of this real? Is that guy real? Is he really going to show up in the midst of this pain? And my church watched and served and prayed for us and walked us through miracle after miracle. I mean, I have an angel story. It used to be that I would sit there and listen to people like Richard and Miranda come up here and share the crazy, I'm in Africa and an alligator grew wings and saved me from dying in a snake pit or something. And that wasn't that you guys that had that story? No, it was somebody else. But you know what I mean? Like, it was like that stuff happened somewhere else, and I needed that kind of stuff to happen for me, whether that was selfish or, whatever. That was just the space that I was in, and Jesus didn't disappoint. And I know that not every story has a happy ending like that, but for us in our journey, it was very much Jesus was shaping a place where anybody could say anything, anybody could question anything. And this deep desire for the real presence of Jesus to manifest himself and do crazy stuff was birthed through our suffering and our pain and our ending up on depression medication and all that kind of stuff that I think is just fantastic. But Jesus met us in the midst of that and shaped our DNA and shaped who we are as a church, so that when we go to the table every week and break that bread and dip it into that cup and experience healing and see that candle burning, that it is a real searching journey of, is this guy real? And what difference does that make in my life? And is he going to speak and show up? And yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now, that's a real risky thing to do for a pastor, to get up and to say, I don't even know if I can believe any of this stuff. I don't even know if Jesus is real. I have no idea. That kind of doubt and vulnerability really goes against all of the self-preservation things we've been taught in church. Now, when we were talking about this, you mentioned how you were really so broken, you couldn't help but spill that.
Yeah.
But that wasn't always the case. You must have felt pressure in other seasons of life, or even you might even feel it now when things are going smooth, to not let that vulnerability seep out. Is that something that you've experienced, or do you have to fight against? Or, tell us a little bit about maybe that kind of pressure that we kind of feel that we need to have everything put together.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think this has come as a surprise to anybody, but there's definitely something about this and what we do and what I watched my dad do for years and years here and in other churches and things like that, that just naturally, whether you like it or not, creates this expectation that whoever's up here speaking has somehow got this figured out in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, there's certainly education and there's things that help us. But the fact is, I hate to tell you, but he's pretty messed up. I don't even know him that well, but I'm pretty sure that I can say that with some degree of certainty. Because I am, and that kind of vulnerability, that kind of space, that kind of place where Jesus can step in and really begin to work with people, honestly, I think only happens with the more vulnerable you get, the more trust that gets earned, and the more space and grace and freedom you allow people to stand up and say, I don't know if any of this is true. I don't know. I need to talk to you about how I don't have this all figured out, and I'm not the perfect example of everything. And so, yeah, I think people like you and I live with a bit of that expectation, but the best thing that a community like this can do is practice vulnerability, and that means allowing somebody like Stafford to also practice vulnerability and preaching and living his life with his family in front of all of you and doing all that, yeah.
Yeah, which I appreciate, having gone through a similar season, probably not to the same extent that you had gone through, but understanding that, yeah, we're all pretty messed up, and the person that you just hired to be your lead pastor is pretty messed up, and I'm relying on Jesus to help me to grow as a person, to become more like him in those ways. But there's definitely something that happens when we gather as a church. There's a certain expectation. Perhaps it's more pronounced in certain environments, but a church Sunday morning definitely has a certain expectation that when we come, we need to have our act together. You need to have your clothes the right way. Aaron graced us with a tie this morning. We need to have our breath, making sure it doesn't smell like last night's bar. We need to make sure that we have all of our appearances kept up, for fear that someone might see through our vulnerability and our cracks, and they might actually see that you're messed up, which is kind of like the perfect place where we need to actually be at. Because you can't actually encounter Jesus in real ways unless you actually understand just how messed up you are and how much you need him. Because the ministry that Jesus actually does in us and through us is exactly at those really hard points in our life. Jesus can meet us on mountaintops when things are going great and we can just rejoice in his presence with us. But there's also a certain element that we get to have those mountaintop experiences because we've walked with him through really hard things too. How has this vulnerability that kind of helped form Ancaster Village Church at the beginning, how has that played out for your congregation down the road? As you've now been in a spot where you're able to care for and love Ancaster, how does that foundation of vulnerability allow people to encounter Jesus where you are?
Yeah, well, so it's definitely a work in progress, and it's a frightening thing. There's no doubt that if you lean to the highly introverted side of the spectrum, and a place that's like that is scary to get involved in because you have an immediate sense that it's going to require something of you. You can't very easily just be a spectator from the sidelines, and because you know that it's this living this kind of vulnerability and being open and asking for help and that kind of thing, just it demands something of you, really, that our culture likes to suppress as best as it can. the beautiful thing that it does create, if you're willing to give it a chance and invest in it, is, I mean, there is nothing like the moment when somebody says, I need prayer for this because this is happening, or this is broken, or this relationship is wrecked, or I need physical healing in this way. When they stand in the middle, you get to anoint them with oil and the entire congregation comes around them. I mean, preach all the sermons in the world, sing all the songs. Those are the moments where that kind of vulnerability and that kind of willingness to enter into that dangerous space, where you go, okay, this is more than just a service group that does nice things. There is something uniquely divine and supernatural and mysterious taking place here. So, you know, that's my best example. That's the image that comes to mind when I think of what you can find when you start to function like that as a community.
Yeah, there's been neat experiences that I've had in ministry that have shaped the church community that I've been a part of in really unique ways that all have to do with, they all center on Christ's presence with us. That really anything that we want to do, any sermon that's preached, like you said, song that's sung, ministry program that's executed, whatever it might be that's able to be pulled off with the best ability, really get trumped totally by Jesus' presence with you. And there's been neat things where very broken people, that's the wrong way. That paints people the wrong way. People who come into a church environment and they say, I felt very welcomed here. And I say, oh, that's great, because we want our church to be a welcoming place. Tell me more about that. And they'll say things like the greeter at the door welcomed me, but it was more than just being welcomed by the person at the door or being welcomed by the parking lot attendant or whatever. They say, I felt welcomed, like, to be here, and I've never felt like that anywhere else in my life. And I said, oh, that's easy, that's Jesus. That's what you felt, is you felt Jesus welcoming you into our midst. And that's just great. And the fact that you don't have to put on an appearance or to pretend that you have your life together, because this guy just finished a smoke outside, came back, he's like making sure, like, stressed out, do I fit in this religious community? And if it were just a religious community, he wouldn't fit. But because it was a community centered on Jesus, he just felt very welcomed. And it was in that moment he was able to be included into our church community because it was Jesus who had personally welcomed him here. You had shared a story, or the reason why you talked about this picture with the icon and the candle and the oil and everything as kind of starting off kind of as like, I guess this is what we do. And sometimes us as Protestants kind of have this real hard time living in that mystery of Jesus' presence with us. And we're going to be moving to a time of communion, but I'd love for you just to give us a real snapshot, or just a quick one or something of how Jesus' presence with us when we come to the table, how it is so much more than just a little cup and a cracker or bread and wine or whatever it might be, but it's something bigger than that. There's a bit of a mystery to it.
Yeah, so you want me to explain the communion table in 10 seconds or less?
No, I want you to explain, I want you to give us a glimpse of how it's been, how Jesus' presence has shown up in Ancaster Village Church by giving space for encountering Jesus through the sacrament.
Yeah, I mean, for whatever reason, probably because Jesus instituted it, it's a good place to start.
Probably.
But for 2,000 years, the church has had this climactic experience as a part of its gathering to say the most important thing. Sermons are important, scripture's important, all this stuff. But the most important thing is a reminder, is an opportunity to experience that Jesus is real, that his presence is real. And this thing that we do has always been the centerpiece of that. Now, in different traditions, maybe we've lost a little bit of that, but there is something to be said about this rubbing shoulders with people that you do this life together with on your journey from there to Jesus, where he, in a way that I could never write a paper, in a way that I could never preach a good enough sermon to explain, where he meets with you in this moment in some kind of unique way. And, you know, in our church, and I fully recognize different churches have different perspectives on this, but I would never tell someone that they're not allowed to come to the table, because in a way, what I hear myself saying is, you can't come to Jesus because he's here in some kind of unique way. And I actually believe that for some people, maybe their first real life story of meeting Jesus could be in coming to the table where he's present in some kind of unique way. And so I just don't feel like I have any kind of authority to say, I don't know, Jesus might not be for you. In our church, every week, you know, with the kids, we run into each other, we bang shoulders, we come forward, we take the bread and the cup. I begin that time by saying, for Christ lived, Christ died, Christ rose again, Christ in us, Christ with us, and Christ will come again, as the centerpiece of why we do what we do, and the expectation of why we're there. That picture of him, that candle that burns, the bread and the cup, the oil, all of it is about meeting with him and hearing him say your name and hearing him say, I'm here.
Beautiful. We're going to be transitioning into receiving communion together, receiving the bread and the cup together. I'll invite the worship team to come up. And I do love the fact we're going to have it so you can actually come to the front to receive communion together. We're going to have servers in the balcony that just to reduce the time on the stairs. But I love the actual act of coming forward to receive from Jesus. It actually is, in a way, a sacrament, which is an external sign of an internal change in that way, or an external sign of internal grace that's been extended to you, that you actually get to come and you get to receive this. And you may have grown up in church and you've received communion numerous times. In fact, it might just be rote. This is what you do. But when we come, we actually come expecting Jesus to meet us, that in some way he is here. And so I invite you to come forward, and there's a little diagram so we create less confusion of how we get up here for the communion table, to come and receive communion. And whether you've never been to church before or have been to church before, we invite you to do this. Jesus got in trouble with all the religious people because he ate with the wrong crowd. He invited people who were very broken, a little too messy. Maybe they didn't have the affluence to hide their messiness, like sometimes we can do. And he said, no, come and eat with me. And the religious people didn't like it because it was just a little too much grace being poured out. So I love the fact that we can invite you to the table where Jesus is, where he loves you and he cares for you. He came, he saw and took notice of you and gave his life up for you so that you can have intimacy with him. So I invite you to come forward as broken, messy people, not because you've earned your way to get here, but because Jesus came for you. And together we will receive communion. So as the band leads us in musical worship, I invite you forward to come and take part in worship through communion as well.